What up, y'all? The Knight of Green here, and I just finished all the challenge mode islands in Jurassic World Evolution on the highest difficulty imaginable, and I think it was time for me to remake my challenge mode strategy guide after all of this experience. So, disclaimer, this guide is geared towards the default dig site route of challenge mode, as I'm still experimenting with the randomizer dig site challenge. However, so far from what I've gathered from the randomizer runs, they function pretty much the same as the basic challenges, except you just need to find whatever the most cost-effective dinosaur is available to you and then dig for that, if you don't have access to Struthiomimus, of course. But for this guide, be warned, as things can and still will go wrong for you. So if you want to be that type of person and save scum, you can save before storms, the first sight of diseases, or periodically in general, so you can allow yourself a do-over if you feel that a situation happened that just took a nosedive for the worst. However, even if you decide not to save scum the whole run and make do with all the bad or good that happened in a situation, in general, following these chips will overall get you completed with the challenge run in well under par time. So another thing that why I am making this guide specifically for Jurassic mode is when you complete the Jurassic mode challenge, you unlock both of the skins that are available for the island as opposed to doing two separate runs. So it's just best to get it out the way first. And so, yeah, while this guide is mostly for the Jurassic level difficulty, it can apply to all modes, but there might be some slight differences. So, like on easy and medium, you might instead want to focus on getting dinosaurs out fast versus completing their genome. But other than that, they pretty much function the same, except just different times of which research happens and stuff like that. However, one thing to note is that if you're a big fan of Jurassic Park Operation Genesis, if you play the randomizer mode and play it on easy and medium, it does feel very reminiscent of the Operation Genesis mode. So, I like playing that nowadays because it's easy, it's fun, and it's just, very nostalgic for me. But anyway, let's get into the main part of the guide now, which you guys wanted to hear. So as mentioned earlier about my first guide, while I do admit that it's still pretty useful and relevant, it's not as refined or as optimal for faster completion time. And so while in the previous guide, you probably get the run done in within about 9 to 10 hours, in this new guide that I made, you can shave about 2 or 3 hours and you can finish all the islands within 7 or 8 hours, even if they're the high dinosaur requirement items. But I definitely know that it's possible to get lower completion times than even with my guide, but these involve a lot of riskier power plays and big investments, so this guide is more so for those who want to make it out of challenge mode under par time, but in a relatively riskless and safe way. Whenever you play the challenge mode, there are 3 essential stages to the game. There's the early game, the mid game, and the end game. So the early game is focusing on getting your feet off the ground through accomplishing the first star of your park, and ends right as soon as you have installed the dig yield upgrade into your expedition center. The mid game is saving a lot of money from selling off the materials from your digs while adding in new species to your park at a steady rate, and this part of the game ends after completing the unique species requirement. And the end game, finally, is where you used all that saved money from the end game to pump out the high tier dinosaurs in a dash to the finish line. As was said before, the goal of the early game is to get the first star, which will then allow you to research the dig yield upgrade, which is essentially the most useful thing you will get in the game. The first steps are to build the small power station, an expedition center, and the fossil center, in that order and nothing else for the time being. You can then constantly send dig teams out to get fossils, with Struthiomimus being the safest bet to acquire first, then you can go for other dinosaurs. The simplest methodology of getting the first star that I've found is to complete easy contracts like sending out dig teams, getting fossils, completing genomes, and then you'll use this to save money to build other essential buildings. But you will only build things like the Ranger or ACU stations when you're given the instruction to do so as a contract, because when you do this, you'll save money on the construction of the building when those contracts are complete. So if you're given an unfavorable contract that you don't think you'll complete anytime soon within the first star, you can either pay money to replace that contract with a new one, and hopefully you get a better one, or if you want to save scum after completing a contract and then simply restart until you get a favorable one, you can also do that to save money and make a bit before going on to the next stage. But be careful when you do a lot of contracts, as you want to make sure that each of the factions are having a balanced rating, as you will experience sabotage regardless. But something that I've noticed after the update 1.8 is that the decay rate of faction approvals has been removed entirely from challenge mode. So previously you had to worry about factions slowly disliking you over time for really no reason. And as a result, I kind of really didn't want to invest in these factions, because what's the point of investing in them if they're going to start disliking me later down the line? And funnily enough, if you didn't invest in the factions at all and all the ratings stayed low or nil from the get-go, they won't dislike you because I guess they had nowhere lower to go. But still, while you can invest in them and they'll stay consistent, it's just best to wean yourself off. I mean, you can do it now, but you might do it a little later. But once you saved enough money from contracts and have a viable or completed genome, in my opinion, I prefer having a completed dinosaur genome, so I prefer to have the full rating, so I don't have to worry about investing in success rate for non-complete genomes, as well as getting the maximum rating from that completion. But yeah, after you get that, place down a Hammond Creation Lab, and this is the important part, is that build a small little fence around the Creation Lab, because what you're going to do is you're going to use this one singular Hammond Creation Lab to be your feeder to multiple enclosures. So you might have 3, 4, even 5 different enclosures that branch off of this one Hammond Creation Lab. So you'll save up a lot of money here. But for the early first part where you're getting that first star, you only need about 2 or 3 enclosures filled with Struthiomimuses. And then once you got Edmontosaurus, Triceratops, or other herbivores, you can then invest in, dabbling in a little bit to help decrease the variety penalty, which is your biggest thing you have to fight against in the first star. But once you get a steady stream of dinosaurs pumping out with a little bit of variety going in to help, make sure that you have different amenities like fast food or gift shop and other things like that around the different viewing areas. So you want to make sure that your guest rating is always maxed out, because since your dinosaur rating is always going to be taking a hit, making sure that how your guests feel about the park is always high will definitely help get you past the first star part really quickly. But an issue that you may experience when dealing with the first part of the challenge run is the fact that you might run out of power. So if you have any buildings that you're not directly using, like the Rangers or ACUs or hatcheries at the time, you may deactivate them so the power will always go to the useful areas. But yeah, as long as you do contracts to get money, constantly feeding small amounts of dinosaurs and keep your guests happy, you should be able to get the first star in under an hour, even less if you can. But if you do that within that time, then you should be good to go for the rest of the run. And honestly, getting the first star is usually the most difficult part of the run, and everything else will just come smoothly once this part has gone through. So now we're on to the mid-game. Mid-game is honestly my favorite part of the game, as it's the easiest to deal with, but it's also the most fun, as well as the longest part of the game. So after we got the research center getting our dig yield upgrade and placing it on all of our expedition slots, make sure you get the research extraction speed so the fossil center can keep up with the expeditions. So you are constantly sending out dig teams to make money from sellable materials, as well as to extract DNA from fossils. This is your primary way of making and saving money, as it is the only source of untaxable money outside of pictures and constructs. But the problem with taking a lot of pictures is that it takes you away from doing what you need to do to expand your park. And again, with contracts, they can ask you to do all sorts of ridiculous things. But honestly, towards the mid-game and late-game, contracts start getting too expensive to cancel. So it's honestly best to just keep contracts you won't complete and just not worry about the faction once you've already have them stabilized in their favor. So anyway, during the mid-game, what you need to think about is answering this following question. What will your dinosaur composition be like to meet the unique species requirement? Do you want to focus on primarily herbivores? Do you want a handful of easy to manage carnivores? Or do you want to pump out like the big high-rated carnivores or hybrids? Well, essentially the way of creating the park stays the same regardless. There is a slight difference in what technologies you may want to invest in. But in my opinion, the technologies that are useful to invest in are different anonymities like arcades, closed shop, restaurant, and bars. Basically all the versions that have a maxed out stat in all the different areas that please the guests. For your rangers and ACUs, you want the ranger scheduling and whatever accuracy or reload speed you can offer. For the power plants, go for the power reduction cost. And in general, you want to make sure you get all the dig teams available to you, all the research teams available to you. Make sure you research all the diseases so you can cure them once they hit your park, as well as any additional fossil sites of dinosaurs you may want, storm defense, and decreased research costs, which will definitely improve a lot of, like, it will improve on saving your money on research. And if you're doing a lot of dinosaur transportation, i.e. you only have one hatchery that's going to be pumping out dinosaurs, or only a few, and you're going to need to tranquilize this in a ranger team, investing in the speed increase for the transport unit will help with that a lot. And it's really only useful to get that once you have research costs down, because it can be a very expensive upgrade without this. So if you personally prefer to want to invest in herbivores, go into the paleobotany section and go for the feeders and all the plant types that boost the herbivores that you have most commonly in your park. However, on the flip side, if you want to invest in carnivores, focus on getting the success rate for incubations down, because you're going to be going for including aggressive instincts 1 gene modification or other neutral or positive cost-effective genes. You want to also increase the social limits and or the comfort threshold so they can last long in storms. But for the social limits, so, you know, if you want to stuff 4 T-Rexes in a pen, that's better than having just 1 T-Rex. And you may also want to go for strong fencing, because, again, some of these carnivores can be very adept at breaking out, so strong fencing is always a good thing. But be warned, though, because if you want to invest in just placing high-tier carnivores, it's a much more risky strategy than investing in the herbivores. And also much more risky if you want to have a handful of easy-to-manage carnivores like Herrerasaurus, Ceratosaurus, Metriacanthosaurus. These are the safest bets of carnivores. Everything else is pretty finicky unless you genetically modify them to tolerate things like storms. But yeah, even though mid-game is the longest, I again, as I've stated before, I find it the most fun because it's fun to save money and then, you know, prepare for the end game. But end game ends, I would say, approximately once you have acquired your unique species requirement for your island, and that is when you'll not suffer any penalty for any species you make. Okay, now we're on to the late game. For me, late game is not as hard as the early game, but I would say the late game is the most annoying part of the game, because this is where natural disasters like tornadoes, disease, and storms will strike back against your park constantly and do everything in their power to essentially put your run to a halt. So, and another unfortunate thing about the late game is usually when the game starts to lag, because if you have 1 billion dinosaurs and 1 billion people in your park, it's just going to start chugging. And this can cause an issue where, because the game's lagging, it may misread your inputs and do stuff you're not trying to do, and it can be a severe annoyance, especially on the large islands. So, But anyway, in-game starts, as I said, by the time where you have finished meeting your unique species requirement, which should be for most islands around the 3.5 to 4 star overall rating when this part starts. So in my previous guide, I shouldn't say I made the mistake, but I wanted to focus on getting all available species in the park going, but realistically, this is not needed or required of you to do. But when you get to the end game, you just use the money that you saved up all along during the end game, not the end game, the mid game, to invest in the high tier dinosaurs to maximize the dino ring. So this is where you're basically gonna either invest in all the super T-Rexes that you've made, or you wanna invest in like sauropods or anything that has high ratings like that. But during this, you'll also be replacing dinos that may have died of old age. And you want to do this because you want to maintain the variety, so you don't have any decreases. But again, depending on the strategy that you wanted to use, like either carnivores or herbivores. But for herbivores, you want to make sure you got the paleobotany to cater to most of the species that you have going. Especially go for hadrosaurs, iguanodonts, and sauropods, because with these types of species, they have a lot of overlaps in the foods they eat, and they also gain the most benefits from the paleobotany system. But if you like predators, just get all the big boys that you want up, and then spam Dilophosauruses with aggressive instincts or whatever, and you should be pretty much fine in that regard. So here are some basic tips that will help keep your park running smoothly through all of the 3 stages of the game. First tip, outside of smaller islands like the Takano Research Center, you'd want to spread your park out instead of keeping everything bunched up in the same area. When you bunch buildings up as well as enclosures, you essentially are opening your park to more devastation when a tornado comes through the park. And this can be an issue as when free dinosaurs can venturing into neighboring enclosures, this can cause issues with overcrowding, which can become a mess after the storm is over. If you split the park into 3 or 4 big sections, which honestly some islands force you to do anyway, tornadoes can become an absolute joke, as they will at worst affect one section and sometimes miss your park entirely. And you can easily deal with most tornado threats by just following it around with the fence tool, fixing any holes that it makes, and then sending a ranger team to fix the buildings that it may have hit. Another tip is that I would suggest having storm protection over at least your essential buildings. I mean, you can have it over more of your park if you want to help save cost on fixing things, but the reason why you want storm defense over your essential buildings is because if these buildings are taken out, they will stunt the growth of your park, and you have to restart them in order to continue your path to success. Another tip I would say is try to have at least $1 million on you at all times in case of emergencies. And you'll never know what you're going to have to deal with, so always having this money can allow you to have a safety net so you can deal with whatever life throws at you. If you're on large island spaces, make sure you have multiple ranger buildings or ACU buildings to handle the needs of your park, and you want to constantly have a ranger team or 2 restocking feeders, just going through a line, just going through all the feeders, and then make sure you always have some cars on standby. This way, whenever like a pressing issue occurs in your park, like fixing buildings or diseases or what have you, you won't have to worry about your feeders running out during these events of crisis, and you'll always have vehicles that are free and able to address the task as soon as they are to occur. One little tiny tip is with extracting dinosaur DNA. So whenever you are extracting DNA, make sure you prioritize extracting the higher tier fossils, so like the ambers or the 3-star fossils first, because believe it or not, if you extract the higher DNA fossils first, you will get more DNA extracted first versus if you had extracted DNA from the smaller fossil and then doing the bigger one. So reorder your fossil extraction and always, again, go for the bigger ones first, then going for the smaller ones. That way that will save time on you sending out dig teams, as well as you will get the 100% genome which you need to complete faster on dinosaur species. So another tip is when you are in the mid game, I would suggest investing slightly over the minimum unique species requirement. So just in case if some of your dinosaur species die off completely and go extinct, like for example, Struthiomimuses usually die towards the end of mid-game, you won't take a severe hit to the dino rating as if you had some more above when your Struthiomimus or whatever you have die out, then you'll still have enough to meet at least the base requirement of the unique species. Another thing that with the Claire update that I really do appreciate is the paleobotany. It is definitely one of the best mechanics introduced that can help with challenge mode, and I think it's wise to invest in it. As I said earlier, the best herbivores to invest in would be hadrosaurs, iguanodonts, and sauropods, mainly because they overlap in many of the food preferences, and compared to like the stegosaurs and ankylosaurs or the ornithopods, they gain the most out of paleobotany. And to give an example, if you have an enclosure of 10 iguanodons and 10 iranosauruses, which is the maximum amount of iguanodons have a max social of 10 and a max population of 20, and Iraanosaurus max population of 10, so they go hand in hand. But you can have approximately a rating of a little over 1,200 if all members are eating from a paleo feeder with all of their preferred foods. And hilariously enough, the sauropod dinosaurs get such a high jacked up rating when they have their tall feeders in, that their individual rating is comparable to that of like a large carnivore, with, for example, Dreadnoughtus getting a rating that rivals that of Giganotosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus. And if you wanted to go with, say, the hybrid route and go for Ankylodochus, that sucker right there will get a rating higher than that of a T-Rex with the paleo feeder. So unfortunately, with the paleobotany feature that was added, you can only invest in a handful of herbivores, but again, these three that I just mentioned will gain the most benefit from the paleobotany strategy. But another tip is to balance out with balancing out anemones, try limiting the number of viewing vents or viewing towers and using hotels as a method to increase dinosaur visibility. So it's with the anemones, you essentially want to build them around your hotels as close as you can to save space, and then instead of like trying to create a bunch of anemones surrounding different things, you want to have at least only one or two, and then increase the staff in order to fit the different needs. But you definitely don't want too many viewpoints, because you want to make sure you have things condensed. And so you can feed and take care of the different area, as opposed to like spreading out the dinosaur visibility and the needs of the guest. You just want to have those in small sections, so they'll be fine. But if you do want to invest in dinosaur viewing vents or towers, make sure that they can see into multiple different enclosures, so the dinosaur visibility rating will go up. But again, from what I've observed, hotels are actually pretty good for keeping the dinosaur visibility up, so just try building stuff around them, which is pretty useful. But another cautionary thing to worry about when building like vents and stuff, try to avoid building them on fences directly, because they may take away from the enclosure space of a dinosaur. So if you're really pressed on space, make sure you pay attention to that, because dinosaurs they will go insane if they lose a centimeter of their needed space. So, just be mindful of that. And also, regardless of how you build visibility structures, always place the water and food sources close in range to the visibility areas, the blue areas. So, for the most part, dinosaurs will stay in those areas to get their needed resources. I mean, they'll sometimes wander off, but as long as they're, for the most part, in those areas, you'll maintain a high dinosaur visibility rating, and the anemones associated with those viewing areas will have high business, because it's really more dinosaurs that you can see. Higher dinosaur ratings that are nearby, those places will make a lot of money. So now we're going to go to the more things to avoid. There's still tips and all, but these are like the things you shouldn't do. So I would avoid getting the increased power output upgrades for the power stations, because I find them pretty worthless, as all they do is invite more power outage, and you theoretically, most islands, if you space things properly, should have enough space to fit all the power stations you would need. And as a result, you should avoid getting the outage protection because plants will not fail unless they're hit by a storm or something. So they essentially don't have a chance to fail. I would also avoid doing a lot of gene modifications on dinosaurs, as most of the high tier gene modifications outside of the one edition of things like aggressive instincts will have a negative cost benefit. Like, they will fail the cost benefit analysis. You'll pay more than what they're worth. I mean, but if you do want to invest in higher genes, I would say it's mostly the social or comfort level genes that you want to dabble into those for the sake of keeping dinosaurs able to deal with storms, or to keep them so they can have a large large pack. But, again, be warned, as the more modifications you do to a dinosaur, that will greatly increase the cost, make them more prone to dying during the incubation process, as well as increase the time they will hatch. So, I mean, if you're going to invest in gene modifications, you're going to have to, by default, invest in the success rate and incubation speeds to keep them able to survive and keep them coming out fast. Another thing I would say to avoid is the super defense building, or strong, whatever it's called. It really doesn't offer that much more protection over the standard building, and it has a significantly reduced range of protection. So it's not really worth investing in. I would say if you're investing in carnivores or any dinosaurs that like to break out or just be, general jerks around the park, don't use the lowest tier fencing if you're concerned about these species, and you can go for the higher investing. You can go invest in the higher tier fencing, and you can do small interlocking rings to improve protection and the safety of your guests, because, of course, you don't want lawsuits when the dinosaurs break out and kill everybody. So, yeah. I would say, with the earlier point, I would say never place enclosures that have high dinosaur populations next to ones with low populations. So when a tornado or another disaster strike hits, you don't want all your Struthies running around with your Ankylosauruses, making them upset because they just don't like too many people, so they get upset. So try spreading out enclosures so even if stuff gets out, it's not going to affect too much else outside of the immediate area. So another thing that I've noticed is that the combat infantry mechanic, while it's not really something that I actively try to use, because the dinosaur that wins the encounter or kills the other dinosaur will only get half the rating of the dinosaur that was killed, meaning that you essentially paid for half of the money you paid for half of the rating that you invested in. But, however, what I've noticed is that this can be an option that you can use. You can use combat infamy if you want to retire animals that are nearing or past their life expectancy. So when a dinosaur does die of old age or any other disease or whatever, they lose all of their rating. But if you were to sacrifice that dinosaur to another one, then at least half the rating is saved. So it's kind of like, I guess they live on through that new dinosaur. This strategy is especially useful on maps that already have wild dinosaurs that you don't pay for. So, those dinosaurs, they generally will die of old age before the run is complete. So when you notice that their life expectancy is nearing the end of it, when it's nearing the end of its life, you may want to sacrifice it to a predator or something. So at least, some of that dinosaur's rating lives on through the thing that killed it. However, this can be a gamble, as from what I've noticed, dinosaurs can exceed their life expectancy by a huge margin. So sometimes you may sacrifice a dinosaur that may or may not have lasted far longer. So it's a gamble if you want to do it like this. Another thing is, I would not rely on building too many hatcheries because they're expensive to get up. But on the flip side, I wouldn't use an ACU to copter transport all my dinosaurs if the cost of moving and tranquilizing all the dinosaurs was greater than that, than building a hatchery. But try to balance between the hatcheries and stuff. I mean, again, the best thing that I've suggested is to have one hatchery branch off into multiple enclosures, but make sure they're spaced out so stuff doesn't get in. I mean, there's just a few things to consider, but do you as you see fit when it comes to that. Find a nice median. But when it comes to other buildings, make sure you don't place extra buildings that you don't need, and delete anything that's unused. And especially in the end game, once you finish researching all the stuff that you find or will think is useful, you should delete your research building, because when you do that, you're able to save up on electricity, as well as you have additional space for something else. But definitely one of the things that you should not stop doing is you should not stop checking the comfort levels of all the dinosaurs in your care. Because when it comes to doing all the sorts of things, you may never know if a dinosaur or a group of dinosaurs is feeling under the weather, or if they're feeling like they want to break out or something. Just always be constantly checking to making sure their comfort's always at the maximum. And so, things will run smoothly, because you don't want a dinosaur to break out and just be like, oh, well, I didn't know they were upset. So it's best to always keep an eye out for things before it becomes an issue. But the most important thing that I would say is to stay focused and have fun. You can experiment with the game a bit, like you could try the free island, or you can reset some of your story mode islands to preemptively design your dream challenge mode park. You can experiment with different enclosure sizes, experiment with different matches with dinosaurs, and even on challenge mode you can do multiple saves to try different strategies or ideas to see if the risk you might take, or a certain way you want to do something, is worth it in the end. But yeah, this is the end of my guide, my second guide here. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. And anyway, signing out. Peace.
You've done it. Reached the top. The pinnacle. I always knew we'd make a great team.